Rejoice, episode 90. Time for a change. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Joyce himself called the first three chapters of Ulysses collectively the Telemachiad. Telemachus, or some say Telemachus, was the son of Odysseus, who set off on a long journey to find his missing father. You don't need me to tell you that Homer's Odyssey has been seen in all kinds of metaphorical ways: the quest for manhood, as well as the search for a father, the travelling of a lone man through a turbulent and moody universe, the soul's search for heaven, etc. In Ulysses, the Telemachus figure is Stephen Dedalus, whom we first meet while he is unhappy in the Martello Tower in Sandymount with his false friend, the jovial and ultimately abusive Buck Mulligan. We next meet Stephen in Chapter 2 at the school where he has been an occasional teacher. And now, in Chapter 3, we meet him as he's alone and walking by the sea on Sandymount Strand near Dublin, one of the most famous chapters in the novel. This chapter is known as Proteus, and let me tell you a tiny anecdote about the early steps of its first journey into print. Margaret Anderson, a fine woman from Indiana, had founded a literary magazine in Chicago called The Little Review. Her literary editor, scout, introducer, was the poet Ezra Pound, a man of astounding talent himself, and a great admirer of James Joyce's writing. Pound suggested to Margaret Anderson and to her partner and lover, Jane Heap, that they begin to serialize Ulysses and publish the first three chapters. When Margaret Anderson read the opening words of Chapter 3, she burst into tears. "This," she said, "is the most beautiful thing we'll ever have. We'll print it if it's the last effort of our lives." And she did, in March 1918, and thereby hangs a long tale of censorship and prosecution. And I'll begin telling you that one day soon. Chapter 3 is pivotal. There used to be in school geometry a moment known as pons asinorum. Ever heard of it? Pons asinorum. In translation, the bridge of donkeys. And I think it was Theorem 5, or maybe you knew it as Euclid's fifth proposition, which was that the angles opposite the equal sides of an isosceles triangle are themselves equal. And it was called pons asinorum because the student who couldn't understand it was an ass. And this was the bridge of learning that asses didn't have enough wit or energy to cross. Well, I used to always think of Chapter 3 in Ulysses as pons asinorum, because it's where I first floundered. All those times, years and years and years ago, I tried to crack it open, and all those times I failed to cross this bridge or just gave up. And then, I began to read it alone and slowly. Why alone? Because I read it out loud, and I read it as it was written, largely a stream of consciousness, which is what I'll now be doing here every week for the next year and more. And slowly, we'll all cross the bridge together and be donkeys no more. Why is it called Proteus? Well, I'll give you the short answer first, and the reference will surface again and again as we go through the chapter. Proteus was a god of the sea, and he was capable of changing his shape, his appearance, his very being. In Homer's Odyssey, Menelaus, one of the heroes of the Trojan War, was trying to get home again, and he was advised by a goddess to trap Proteus. As Menelaus tells it, we waited all morning. He's on an island. He's stranded on an island. When the sun reached its noon, the old man of the sea came up from the waves to count his seals. We seized him. At once, with his old tricks, he changed himself, first into a lion with a great mane, and then all of a sudden, with his other shape-shifting tricks, he turned himself into a dragon, a leopard, a wild boar. A moment later, he made himself into a torrent of running water. Then he became a tree. But we never relinquished our grip, and at last he gave in. "What do you want of me?" he asked, to which Menelaus replied, and see the relevance of this in Stephen Dedalus's case, "I have been kept so long on this island, and I see no sign of being able to get away. I am losing all heart." So, Stephen is walking by the sea, and this is a chapter all about change. He too wants to get off the island of Ireland. Right, deep breath. Here comes the famous opening, just 3 sentences of it this week. That's how dense this chapter is going to be. Here we go. Remember, it's Stephen's thoughts we're hearing now. He's not saying this out loud. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust, coloured signs, end of quote. Now, please understand that almost the entire chapter is thought-based. That is to say, you will hear Stephen's thoughts with very little third-party narration from Joyce, and you've already observed that technique at work. In Chapter 1, there was much more narrative than interior monologue. In Chapter 2, we saw the interior monologue increase, and here, in Chapter 3, Joyce goes for it. In fact, he so goes for it that there will be multiple times when I'll point out to you that we're only seeing on the page parts of words to indicate snatches of thought. If ever there were a time to have the text of Ulysses open in front of you, it's now. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. What does that mean? What is he saying? Ineluctable is that which cannot be avoided. Taxes are ineluctable, so is death, if eventually, Mark Twain said it, nothing is certain except death and taxes. As to modality, so many definitions, so many possibilities. Here's a crude shorthand that works in this instance. Modality is the quality of being limited by a condition. In other words, we are limited to some extent by what we see because it is undeniably there, in front of our eyes. And even as Joyce is saying that there are limits in life imposed by the fact that we can only see what we can see, you now have available to you, and perhaps for the first time on his grandest scale, Joyce's capacity to employ or imply multiple meanings. Because modal has musical connotations, modal has grammatical connotations, auxiliary verbs and the like. Modal has philosophical connotations. Aristotelian thought discussed form versus content. And here's the one I like most. Of the five senses, the eye cannot change what it sees, cannot modify, M-O-D, what it sees. That's the argument here. And we're getting this from the pen of a man who feared going blind and who even in his early 20s had bad eyesight. So here is Stephen Dedalus, walking by the sea, anxious to change his frame of mind, to improve the condition of his spirit, and yet he is confined, controlled by what he can see. Here's this wonderful sentence again. At least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. Wonderful phrase, thinking with his eyes. And what can he see? Now comes a terrific word, signatures. Signatures of all things I am here to read. Joyce, remember, was educated by Jesuits. And he couldn't avoid being interested in or coming in contact with theology. In fact, he was enormously interested in it all his life. And he had read, and was in his library, the works of a 16th century German quasi-philosopher, Jakob Böhme, whose bid for immortality was embodied in a book of mystic reportage, if you like, called The Signatures of All Things. Joyce had, as I say, this book. He owned this book. And essentially one of Böhme's arguments was that we see God in all things because they exist, and that the existence of all things amounts to God's signatures. I'd have to condense it crudely, otherwise I'd be here all day. And so what Stephen sees is, in a way, the signature, the identification of his mood. Signatures of all things that he was there to read were the dregs of the ocean, basically, and Joyce lists it. Sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust. On a simpler and more literary than philosophical level, the idea of objects or places being used to portray a character's mood or emotional condition works brilliantly when it's in good hands. Thomas Hardy, for example, used the shifting moods of England's lush pasture land to convey the changing shades of passion. Dickens could brighten a character's spirit by describing the way light came into a room, or tell you of a family's misfortunes by describing the locality where they lived in London. Balzac and Zola used the hangings and decor of France's salons to give us the emotional temperature of their characters. Over and over again, it's one of the delights in literature. And here, and you can take it as a portrait of Stephen's damaged spirit, James Joyce describes that unpleasant piece of marine growth, bladder wrack, seaweed, raw and ragged. You know it, you've seen it, you've handled it. It's got little blisters on it that you can burn with your fingers. It's coarse looking, it's actually unpleasant looking, it's dirty green. And of course, if you remember chapter 1, you'll remember how Stephen recalls his dying mother coughing up green mucus, and how he then went on to compare the bay over which he gazed, Dublin Bay, with that bowl of fatal green slime. What else is he seeing here? The nearing tide, the tide's coming in. That rusty boot. Look at what the sea is bringing him to. Snot green, blue silver, rust. These are the coloured signs, as Joyce says, of how Stephen is and what he's thinking. And yet, he has come here to try and change, to try and be different, to be Protean. The word means change, to consult Proteus, the god of the sea, the very author of change. Let me break this down to its simplest form. Having left Mr. Deasy and the school out in Dalkey, Stephen has wandered towards Dublin, where he has an appointment to meet Buck Mulligan in a pub at noon. He has time to kill. It's 11 o'clock in the morning, and he walks along the beach looking at the incoming tide and what it washes in, and he's reflecting that his mood and his thought are controlled by the garbage that he sees. And as yet, we're only halfway down this opening paragraph. Let me see, that's only 3 sentences, and I think, let me just count. Hold on a second until I get the text. Wait, I count. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 sentences, and we've only done 3 of them this week. You see? You see why I said I'd be here doing this for a quarter of a century? Rejoice, episode 91, Seeing Through. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. As you heard last week, we're taking it slowly for the moment. If you're one of my correspondents who has been wishing that I'd hurry it up, well, let me explain. If I went faster, it would defeat the purpose of unpacking all the references in Ulysses. Secondly, the pace won't always be as slow as we have at the moment. And then again, sometimes it'll be slower. Now, we're in the famous beginning of the famous chapter 3, and we've only dealt with the first 3 sentences. It's around 11 in the morning, in June 1904. The sun is shining on the sea. Stephen Dedalus is both killing time on his journey and contemplating the matter of change of spirit even, as he walks along the untidy sands of Sandymount Strand, south of Dublin. So far, he's been reflecting on how he is commanded by what he sees. Here's the next sentence. It's 4 words long. Limits of the diaphany. Let me remind you again that it's Stephen's thoughts we're hearing, his fragmented musings, the noise of the soundtracks in his mind. Limits of the diaphany, I'll spell it for you. Diaphane. I've heard it pronounced diaphane, but I'm opting for diaphany, if only for the lyricism. Okay, let's have a crack at this. This is fun. Limits of the diaphany. Once you remind yourself of the meaning of the word diaphany, you get another and powerful clue as to what this chapter is all about and what we'll be addressing. Right off, it's important to say that here, under the surface, in this paragraph, the beginning of which we had last week, Joyce has already been running references like underground streams to a sea of philosophy. A philosophy which can be summarized as all addressing the essence of physical existence and how we identify physical existence by simply what we see, ineluctable modality of the visible, and also how physical existence is identified in shape and form and color. Aristotle is a boat on this ocean. So is the German Boehme, whom I mentioned last week. So is the Dublin phenomenologist, Bishop George Berkeley. The man who believed that the reality of matter didn't exist, except principally in the mind as an idea. And we'll come to Bishop Berkeley big time next week. I've said so often before, and no doubt I'll say it again in the next quarter of a century, when in doubt with Joyce, look to the language. So, why did Joyce use diaphany here? Well, first of all, let's go to what the word means. It's generally defined as transparent, and it can mean, a smidgen less accurately, translucent. Both we and the light, it seems in this usage, can see through it. Ladies' night dresses in sexy novels, they were always diaphanous. I've just thought of that. It was no end of a thrill when I was 16. Now, look at the origin of the word, and this is where, as an adult, it gets really exciting. Dia is Greek, a Greek word meaning through, and phainein, Phainein, is a Greek word for show, which comes from phantos, meaning visible. And from it, by the way, comes phantom and the word fantasy. And did Joyce know that too, I ask myself, as he's writing about the intensive processes of the mind, which is, if you like, a kind of definition of fantasy. A fantasy is an intensive process of the mind. Here's why he's using the word diaphane here, or diaphane. He's reaching to Aristotle, who believed that unless an object had color, you had, to say the least, difficulty seeing it. As a companion to this chapter, by the way, you could do worse than reading Aristotle's De Sensu et Sensibility. And you wondered where Jane Austen, however she used the true qualities, got the title Sense and Sensibility from. Janie was very well read. De Sensu et Sensibili. Here's what Aristotle was inquiring into, and I'm quoting from De Sensu. He said, "One might ask, if every body is infinitely divisible, are its sensible qualities, color, savor, odor, sound, weight, cold or heat, heaviness or lightness, hardness or softness, are they also infinitely divisible? Or is this impossible?" Aristotle had already set up this debate in, as it were, the parent document of De Sensu. That was De Anima, of the soul, written around 350 BC, from which, given the famous opening sentence of Joyce's Chapter 3 of Ulysses, which we had last week, Ineluctable Modality of the Visible, here's the most helpful quote for our purposes. This is from De Anima. This is Aristotle. "The object of sight is the visible, and what is visible is A, color, and B, a certain kind of object, which can be described in words, but which has no single name. Whatever is visible is color, and color is what lies upon what is in its own nature visible." Do you get that? Color is what lies upon what is in its own nature visible. I find this stuff just almost unbearably exciting. And he goes on, "Every color has in it the power to set in movement what is actually transparent. That power constitutes its very nature. That is why it is not visible except with the help of light. It is only in light that the color of a thing is seen." There it is. It is only in light that the color of a thing is seen. What a huge mind James Joyce had. Because all through this chapter, do not forget the issue of Joyce's own poor eyesight. And here is Stephen, Daedalus, one of the heroes or anti-heroes, if you like, of Ulysses, in a real sense, swinging between what he can see and what he can't see. Therefore, what is visible to him and what is not. And his life is visible, and his future is not visible. Listen to this. Listen to this. And remember, Joyce would have read what I've just quoted and what I'm about to quote. Aristotle again. He says, "Now there clearly is something which is transparent. And by transparent, I mean what is visible. And yet not visible in itself, but rather owing its visibility to the color of something else. Of this character, not visible in itself, are air, water, and many solid bodies." End of quote. Just think, if you light a fire, smoke gets into the air. That's how you know there's air. That's how you can see it, rather. We know there's air, but that's how you see it. Well, we don't see the air. We see the color of the smoke on the air. I really mustn't digress here, because if I do, we'll be here all day. Where are we? Well, we're by the sea with Stephen, where light is abundant, and on a sunny June morning even more so. Here's Aristotle again. Light is, as it were, the proper colour of what is transparent. And I'll just toss in for good measure what he also said. Neither air nor water is transparent, because it is air or water. We could spend, I assure you, weeks on this. And there are Joycean scholars who have spent years on it. So forgive my impertinence. Please forgive my impertinence at attempting to wrap it all up in a few minutes. But now you know the references and their connections, and you can have a whale of a time exploring them. I do recommend it. It's really, really thrilling. Let me just say, finally, by way of brief summary, that as Stephen Dedalus is walking along Sandybound Strand, what he sees, and what maybe he can't see to quite define, and the light and the water, it all essentially activates in Stephen thoughts of Aristotle and other philosophers. And I just wanted to give you a flavour of the essence of his mindset and his complexity of thought, and the size of Joyce's brain and learning and intellectual confidence in his early 30s when he wrote this. Further complexities next week. Goodbye until then. Rejoice, episode 92, Another Maestro. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and here we go again on the long, slow journey through these early reaches of Ulysses Chapter 3. Not every chapter will be as slow. I'd just like to say that to reassure you now and again. The week before last, I looked at just 3 sentences from the first paragraph. Last week, I managed to get through all the references in just 1 sentence, which was, I remind you, limits of the diaphany or diaphane. Now let's continue, and this week let me shoot for a little more than 4 words. Here's the paragraph that comes after limits of the diaphany. It's Stephen's thoughts we're hearing, remember. Here we go. But he adds, in bodies. Then he was aware of them. Bodies before, of them coloured. How? By knocking his sconce against them, sure. Go easy. Bald he was and a millionaire, maestro di color chisano. Limit of the diaphany in... Why in diaphany, a diaphany? If you can put your 5 fingers through it, it's a gate. If not, a door. Shut your eyes and see. End of quote. At first glance, it's a beauty, isn't it? Here we go. And there's a bilingual pun in there. You know, as if things weren't dense enough, there's a bilingual pun in there, a play in words right there in the middle, one that embodies 2 of Joyce's favourite writers, Aristotle and Dante. We'll come to it presently. So, what, ladies and gentlemen, are we looking at here? As Stephen walks by the sea, we've already been addressing the combination of light and air and translucence and transparency, and the reference is once again Aristotle, so beloved of Joyce. Aristotle, who said this: neither air nor water is transparent because it is air or water. They are transparent because each of them has contained in it a certain substance, which is the same in both, and is also found in the eternal body, which constitutes the uppermost shell of the physical cosmos. Of this substance, light is the activity. And by the way, thoughts have neither air nor water, nor indeed light nor weight, though they may illuminate and have gravitas. So, bear that subtext in mind too throughout this chapter. Back to Ulysses, quoting Stephen's thoughts. But he adds, in bodies. Then he was aware of them. Bodies before, of them coloured. How? That is, Aristotle adds, and I'm paraphrasing, you wouldn't be able to see something unless it had a colour. We had that last week. And Stephen speculates, puzzling it out, Then he, Aristotle, was aware of them, bodies before, of them coloured, just reinforcing the point I've just made. And then Stephen asks how. How was Aristotle aware of things that were so transparent as to be invisible, until he saw that they had colours? And here's the answer, and it's humorous. Stephen thinks, by knocking his sconce against them, sure. He's making the point that Aristotle says we need the colours of things for us to see them. And then comes the comfort, the joke almost. How? How did Aristotle see them? The reality of things, that they really exist? Well, it's proven by the fact that we bump into them. We knock our sconces, our heads against them. Here's where Joyce got his knocking his sconce remark, and I love it. Bishop George Berkeley's philosophies irritated many people. Born in Kilkenny in 1685. He was born, by the way, in a place called Thomastown. I was brought up in another place called Thomastown, about 35, 40 miles away. What a powerful footnote that is. That'll get you your PhD. Berkeley claimed that matter did not exist except in the imagination. And he made this claim because John Locke, the great English 17th century philosopher, leaned so far in his thinking towards science that Berkeley believed and feared Locke was taking us all toward atheism. Berkeley said, in effect, or seemed to be saying, that everything is an idea, that matter does not exist except in the mind. So, Dr. Samuel Johnson, enter another great personality of the era. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the great bear with the brown coat and Tourette's syndrome. Dr. Johnson had a very practical streak in him. He refuted Bishop Berkeley's theory. That's where Joyce got the sconce idea. Here's the story. It's August 1763, and James Boswell, Dr. Johnson's eventually to be famous biographer, is 23 years old. And Johnson, the great dictionary maker and one of the most famous men in England at that time, is 54, 31 years Boswell's senior. Boswell, his kind of adopted son, emotionally anyway. Boswell is on his way from London to Holland to further his legal studies in the city of Utrecht. And Dr. Johnson decides that he'll accompany him from London to the port of Harwich in the east of England, which is the port for Holland, or at least was then, and see him safely on his way. That was the kind, by the way, that was the kind of genuine affection Johnson had for his friends. On the morning in Harwich, before Boswell embarks, they visit the local church. Now, let Boswell take up the story. After we came out of the church, we stood talking for some time together of Bishop Berkeley's ingenious sophistry to prove the non-existence of matter, and that everything in the universe is merely ideal. I observed that though we are satisfied his doctrine is not true, it is impossible to refute it. I shall never forget the alacrity with which Johnson answered, striking his foot with a mighty force against a large stone till he rebounded from it. I refute it thus, said Johnson. So, striking his foot against a stone, knocking his head against objects. Well, that's one way of disproving the non-existence of matter, and probably the best way. So in Ulysses, after the sconce moment, Stephen thinks, bald he was, and a millionaire. And here comes the pun, and the brilliant double reference. Maestro di color che sano. We have so little idea today of how big, how significant was the memory of the classical philosophers in Joyce's time, in Joyce's education. Aristotle was so present that Stephen is able to dwell on an ancient belief about Aristotle, handed down the centuries, bald he was, and a millionaire. It's still believed, I think, that Aristotle was very wealthy, that he was of a wealthy family and owned a lot of land, and the statues and busts of Aristotle show him as bald as an egg. Then comes the Italian quote, Maestro di color che sano. Maestro, well, we know it translates as master. And di color che sano means of those who know. Maestro di coloro che sanno, master of those who know. That is what Dante called Aristotle in the Inferno. Dante places Aristotle at the pinnacle of fame in limbo. What I love here, though, is not just the generous reminder of the power of Aristotle's brain, or Joyce's reference once again to his beloved Dante, but the fact that Joyce used it because the pronoun for the word those in Italian, color, C-O-L-O-R, sounds and looks like the same word for the subject we have been discussing, color. Next phrases: limit of the diaphany. Diaphany, adiaphany. Adiaphany is opaque. So what is Joyce testing now? More next week. Isn't this fun? Rejoice, episode 93, Time and Space. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. On we go with Proteus, chapter 3 of James Joyce's mighty novel Ulysses. It's Thursday, the 16th of June, 1904, and Stephen Dedalus, a young literary gent, is walking along the sands of Sandymount Strand in Dublin. He's about to walk with his eyes closed out in the wide open spaces of the beach. Why? Because he's been thinking about Aristotle and the philosophy of what is visible in life and what is not, what is matter in life and what is not. And so, Stephen, in a perfectly wide, safe space, will close his eyes to test the philosophy of what is audible in life. Are objects real? Are they real because they have color and we can therefore see them and now hear them? Add in the fact that James Joyce had poor eyesight, and we're rocking and rolling. Here's the next little bit of text. Proteus is so dense that I'm doing it in baby steps, as much for myself as for you, by the way. Last week, you may remember, we ended at Stephen shuttling between two words, diaphane or diaphane and adiaphane or adiaphane. Next phrase from last week: if you can put your 5 fingers through it, it's a gate. If not, a door. Shut your eyes and see. That's the thought you heard there from Stephen. Stephen's mind is saying, if you can put your 5 fingers through it, it is a gate. If not, a door. Shut your eyes and see. And remember, and I can't say this often enough for my own good, we're reading the thoughts that are flowing through Stephen's mind. Diaphane or diaphany, we've dealt with, transparent or translucent. Adiaphany, therefore, is opaque. Stephen is juggling opposites and contradictions in his head, as we all do. As to the phrase, if you can put your 5 fingers through it, it is a gate. If not, it's a door. This is Dr. Samuel Johnson again. Well, a parody thereof. If I go to his dictionary, and I'm the proud owner of a facsimile, I'll find his definition of door. Here we go. Door, the gate of a house which opens to yield entrance. Door, he says, is used of house and gate of cities and public buildings, except in the license of poetry. And Johnson, as he often did, or always did almost, backed his definition with a quote from Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. All the castle quaked from the ground, and every door of free will open flew. Oh, and by the way, his definition of gate is a tiny masterclass in economic writing. Here it is. Gate, a frame of timber upon hinges to give a passage into enclosed grounds. Isn't that great? And the phrase, Joyce's phrase, Stephen's thought, shut your eyes and see, hold that in your mind, because it becomes poignant later on in Ulysses. That's enough back-referencing for the moment. Here's this week's quotation. Stephen closed his eyes to hear his boots crush crackling wrack and shells. You are walking through it, howsomever. I am, a stride at a time, a very short space of time, through very short times of space. 5, 6, the nacheinander, exactly. And that is the ineluctable modality of the audible. Open your eyes. No, Jesus! If I fell over a cliff that beetles o'er his base, fell through the Nebeinander ineluctably. End of quote. Ulysses is getting to look and sound. We're getting to see and hear. How interesting is this? And you ain't seen nothing yet. In fact, you're probably saying to yourself right now, what on earth is going on here? Or some variation of same. What you're looking at is what happens when you try and put thoughts literally down on paper as they echo in your mind. You get fragments and interruptions and broken rhythms and God knows what else. Stephen closed his eyes to hear his boots crush crackling rack and shells. That's clear enough, and that, by the way, note again, is a little piece of third-party narration from Joyce just dropped in there to stabilize, as it were, the paragraph, the thoughts, kind of a bookend. And you can hear it, can't you? You've probably done it yourself. Walked along the shore and crunched dried seaweed of all kinds and stepped on the tide line of shells and other crunchable debris. Next phrase. You are walking through it howsomever. I am. A stride at a time, a very short space of time, through very short times of space. 5, 6, the Nacheinander. Exactly, and that is the ineluctable modality of the audible. What's happening here? He's listening to his own footsteps, crackling on the shells and the seaweed beneath his feet. This, by the way, this is a musician's ear at work here. This is Joyce, the fine tenor voice, listening to the note. And what's he walking through? He's walking through a number of things. He's walking through the modality of the audible, which wouldn't happen unless he was walking, and therefore making a walking noise with his boots. I love that Joyce used the word howsomever. Howsomever. It was more than common 50 years ago in Ireland instead of however, as was another variation, how and ever. And there are hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny examples in Ulysses of Joyce's keen ear for demotic, everyday Irish speech. Now, listen to what's going on. This is the verbal representation of a man walking. Stephen says to himself, you are walking through it, howsomever. I am, a stride at a time. What's he walking through? A very short space of time through very short times of space. 5, 6, the Nacheinander. He's counting his steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And here's this German word, Nacheinander, followed by exactly, and that is the ineluctable modality of the audible. Now, we know that James Joyce had an extraordinary width and range of reading. Everything from glances and maybe more at cheap women's magazines. Sorry, should that be... should that be women's cheap magazines? Or maybe not, but we'll get to that too. And he also read the most esoteric of theological and philosophical works. There's a very distinguished Joyce scholar at the James Joyce Foundation in Zurich, Professor Fritz Zenn. For my money, one of the most rigorous Joyceans in the field. And there's some stiff competition. I hope Professor Sen isn't too appalled at my desire to make Ulysses democratically accessible. Now, this word, Nacheinander, it means successively, in succession, one after another, things happening in sequence. And what could be more sequential than our steps as we walk along? In Volume 2, Number 2 of the James Joyce Quarterly, which for 50 years has been coming out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, Professor Zen wrote a piece entitled Aesthetic Theories, in which he said that the German word Nacheinander, and another, which we'll come to in a moment, are likely, says Professor Zen, to be taken from and refer back to Lessing's Laocoon, 1766. In this classic treatise on aesthetics, Lessing brought out the distinction between poetry and the plastic arts. He contends that poetry had to do with actions, i.e. objects, existing one after another in time. In painting and sculpture, objects are presented one beside the other in space. Now, you see, we're really beginning to get what's going on here. Professor Sen goes on to say that Stephen's contrasting the visible, the eye, with the audible, the ear, may owe something to Lessing's remarks on the different impressions received through the eye and the ear. So, Stephen is walking, a stride at a time, A very short space of time through very short times of space, says Joyce, and he counts out the steps, 5, 6, the Nakanander, exactly, he says, and that is or thinks, and that is the ineluctable modality of the audible. One thing after another, with which Stephen agrees. He says so, exactly. He next tells himself to open his eyes, and he changes his mind. Open your eyes. No, Jesus, if I fell over a cliff that beetles o'er his base, fell through the Nebeinander ineluctably. Let me try and simplify this. Action in writing is better rendered through poetry, Lessing argued, in art, in fact, and painting handled objects better. Did you get that? Action is better rendered through poetry, and objects are better rendered through painting. Well, it's a theory. And just a last note, you may remember that we had the cliff that beetles o'er his base in the first chapter. It's Horatio's warning Hamlet that the ghost may be trying to lure Hamlet out onto the battlements to his death. Stephen doesn't want to fall through the Nebeinander, which is the space between objects. I'll come back to Lessing next week. Keep reading. Rejoice, episode 95, Walking on Proust. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're on the shore in chapter 3, Proteus. James Joyce immortalised Sandymount Strand, a strip of beach south of Dublin, on which, of course, he'd often walked, as you'll gather from his earlier, much more autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He knew that part of South Dublin well, from having lived down the road in Blackrock. Now, this chapter 3, it's about many things, and so far we've had Stephen walking along with eyes closed to test what he learns of the world and of matter in philosophical terms by walking with his eyes closed. Can't see, can only hear. And he does have, as you heard last week, that brilliant thought, walking into eternity along Sandymount Strand. The remark succeeds on so many levels. The darkness of eyes shut, the presence or absence of matter, according to what you hear and see, the references to William Blake. It's a perfect miniature example of how literature works as an art form by meaning several things at once. Well, that's Joyce for you, and very much that's Ulysses too. And now we press on with the next piece of the chapter. And if you're looking at the text, and it's really the best way to do this, is have the text in front of you, don't blame yourself for being confused. Here, let me unpack it for you. These are the next words we encounter. Again, I remind you that this is stream of consciousness. Hang on, I'll get my copy. Hold on. This is stream of consciousness, interior monologue, a flow of thoughts, not all of them completed, and not all the words completed either. Where are we? Here we are. Yes, here we are. Here's the text I'm quoting. Crush, crack, crick, crick, wild sea money, Dominie DC kens the ma. Won't you come to Sandymount, Madeline the mare? That's the end of the quote. And by the way, that's all I'm doing this week. And now you're saying to yourself again, in God's name, what's Joyce up to? Well, here we go. Stephen's listening to the sounds his boots are making. Crush, crack, crick, crick, wild sea money. The two are connected. My mother taught us how to count with little shells, and it was a teaching device going back centuries. And may I remind you of a remark I made back in episode 72. And you'll see its relevance in a second or two. Stephen was being paid by Mr. Deasy, the headmaster, and he sees shells on Mr. Deasy's desk. And I remarked that shells in primitive tribes were used as money, especially cowrie shells. And he and DC were at the time, Stephen and DC at the time, were in the middle of a financial transaction. So here is Stephen stepping on seashells by the seashore and thinking of the phrase, wild sea money. And by the way, listen to that. Wild sea money. Do we hear a hint of sea anemone in there? And next we hear the thought, Dominie DC kens the ma. 4 words, and a letter with an apostrophe masquerading as a 5th word. Apostrophe. Scottish for all. Right. Scottish. That's the key. Dominie, you see, is the Scottish, principally I'd say rural Scottish word for a principal teacher, a headmaster. When the late John Smith became leader of the British Labour Party in 1992, much mention was made of his father being a Dominie. And we have just spent an entire chapter in the company of a Dominie, a headmaster named Garrett Deasy, have we not? Thus Dominie Deasy, and it's kind of a mockery as well. Now put the two words together, Dominie Deasy. Well, if you, like me, had been a Catholic altar boy for 9 years, you might hear something else in this, especially if you remember Joyce's upbringing in intense Catholicism by the Jesuits. You might hear the words Dominus Deus, Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanguinis, Dominus Deus Sabaoth, Holy, 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 that's 3 rings on the handbell. Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of thy glory. Hosanna in the highest. Add in the phrase, kens the ma, which from Scottish speech would mean knows everything. So Stephen, he's still having a go at his former employer, and Joyce is still mocking the know-it-all teacher who gets everything wrong. And by the way, the phrase Dominus Deus is all over Catholic worship, or should I say used to be, until they changed it from the Latin to the vernacular. Now, the next 2 lines are, won't you come to Sandymount, Madeline the mare, M-A-R-E, female horse. This is a reference to Joyce's great contemporary Marcel Proust. Proust made the Madeleine biscuit, the cookie, the pastry, the tea cake, call it what you will. He made it famous when the narrator of his massive novel in many books, À la recherche de temps perdu, Remembrance of Things Past, dipped Madeleine tea biscuit into his tea and automatically began to reminisce in great long sentences. And Proust wrote and published this when Joyce's early sense of Europe was at its highest. Joyce, of course, knew of it. Anybody who was literary did in those days. And here's an interesting connection. Proust was writing of memory that's involuntary, prodded by something physical, a tea biscuit. While Joyce is experimenting here with thoughts that Stephen doesn't seem to be trying to stop about things physical and non-physical. Now, how about Won't You Come to Sandymount? There was an old popular song of the day, Won't You Come to My Tea Party? See how the connection builds up? Tea party, tea biscuit. And just to clinch it, some of Proust's 1.5 word novel was illustrated by a French woman artist named Madeleine Lemaire. Different spelling, L-E-M-A-I-R-E. She was also an inspiration for at least 1, if not 2, of his characters. By the way, the great expert on Proust, if you want to read about Proust, was an Englishman called George Painter who really did superb work on the whole Proust thing. Anyway, in Ulysses, Joyce spells it as if it were Madeleine the female horse, the mare. And as I say, in real life, she spelled her name differently, L-E-M-A-I-R-E. And, wouldn't you know it, there's a pun in here too, because what's the French word for sea? You were there before I was. La mer. Stephen is walking along by the sea. And though he spells it mare as female horse, he's still punning on the Latin word for sea, mare, whence comes maritime, and everything else related to the sea. Didn't he get a lot in there, didn't he? And by the way, the Ellman biography has a cool description of the one time that Joyce and Proust met. I know it's a digression, but I'm going to do it anyway. Everybody expected that the 2 giants of world literature, who lived in the same city, would have a great deal to say to one another about structure and syntax and exegesis and modernism and impressionism. They met, finally. The meeting wasn't planned. It happened in May 1922. 3 months after Ulysses was published and famous. Proust was already famous. They met at a party for Stravinsky and Diaghilev after one of their ballets. Joyce was invited to this party, and he went, although he didn't have evening clothes, and he was embarrassed at not having evening clothes, and he was drinking heavily. In waltzed Proust, in a fur coat, looking, Joyce said, like the hero of the Sorrows of Satan. But the 2 great men sat beside each other, and there are various reports of what they said to each other. Joyce remarked, "I've headaches every day. My eyes are terrible." Proust said, "My poor stomach. What am I going to do? It's killing me. I must leave at once." Joyce replied, "I'm in the same situation, if I can find someone to take me by the arm." To which Proust replied, "Jamais. Oh, my stomach." Proust remarked to someone else there, "I regret I don't know Mr. Joyce's work. And Joyce countered with, "I've never read Mr. Proust." Then Proust asked Joyce if he liked truffles, and Joyce said, "I do." And Joyce told Frank Budgeon, his painter friend, that Proust only asked if Joyce knew the Duke of this or the Duchess of that, and Joyce kept saying no, and Joyce summarized for Budgeon by saying, "He wanted to talk about duchesses, but I only wanted to talk about chambermaids." And the hostess asked Proust if he'd read such and such a section of Ulysses, and Proust said, "No," or I suppose, "No." Some meeting, eh? More complex news from Sandymount Strand next week.
Frank Delaney's newest novel, The Last Storyteller, is in bookstores now. To learn more, go to frankdelaney.com.
Rejoice, episode 96A, Reading Lists. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. And those of you who hang out with me here every week know that when you hear the letter A in an episode's title, that we're into bonus time. Yes, another 12 episodes have gone by, and it's time for an extra essay, the Baker's Dozen edition. I do one every 12 weeks. These extra pieces are usually tangential to the direct weekly deconstruction of Ulysses, and I intend them to cast extra light on the book by casting extra light on James Joyce himself. Now, a few weeks ago, deep as we are in Chapter 3, I marveled, and not for the first time, at Joyce's reading list. Heaven knows how many books that man browsed or read completely. How many did he merely sample? How many did he ingest? How many did he digest? In any one chapter of Ulysses, you will find a list of literary and other references that is simply staggering. By other references, I mean anything from philosophy to theology to politics to current affairs. And not only did he visit all these reference points, he knew how to apply them in his work, and to do that, you have to know your stuff. So, in this Baker's Dozen, I'll try and give you some idea of the range of Joyce's reading skills. I use the word skills advisedly. We all know people who read all the time, and we may even number ourselves among them. I certainly do. But heavens above, Joyce's reading experience, Joyce's reading skill, is way outside the ordinary. Now, there's a condition that we must apply before we start praising him too much. James Joyce had two enormous advantages over present-day writers. He lived at a time when education in general in Ireland, from elementary school to postgraduate, was deeper, wider, and more profound. It's still not bad there, by the way. The second advantage had some bearing on that first advantage. He lived at a time when the book or the printed word had slender competition compared to today's circumstances. He was encouraged simply to read as widely as possible. In fact, he and all his fellow students were mandated to do so. So let's begin where he began, as I try to describe to you what his reading was like before I give you the list. Let's begin where he began, with the kind of reading that he would have known from the curricula he had experienced by the time he had the key of the door, as they say, at 21 years of age. And here, whether we like it or not, we must give credit where credit is due to the Catholic Church. All that indoctrination, inculcation, prayer, and general occupation, colonization of the young intellect, all that came from, primarily, a basis in learning. The four evangelists were, after all, writing what became history. We know from the many references across all his major works that Joyce was familiar with later significant church names such as Ignatius of Loyola and Thomas Aquinas. These men were pillars of the church. But they stood among fields of learning because the church was, among other things, a collegiate structure. And as early as his first short story, The Sisters, in the volume Dubliners, Joyce has the young narrator make this remark, quote, "He told me that the fathers of the church had written books as thick as the post office directory and as closely printed as the legal notices in the newspaper." My mother had a saying, a piece of advice for those interested in doing well in the matrimonial market. She used to say, never marry money, but go where money is. Ditto any Catholic child and systems of learning. We were where learning was. It was not possible to be educated by the Catholic Church without being aware of the patterns of thought, philosophy, and therefore learning down through which the centuries of the Church had descended. Remember, all the Church's teaching had evolved from the life of Christ, and that was set in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. So in there, somehow, beneath the surface, bubbling away, was all that exotic history, if only by association. And we all absorbed some of it. How could we not? And alongside that, the implications of philosophy, even philosophy, of which the Church might not approve, never far away. Now, right behind the Church, if you had an Irish Catholic secondary school education, high school education, as I did with the Christian Brothers, and it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as James Joyce's at the hands of the Jesuits, right behind the Church came Shakespeare. And after the Testaments and the Gospels and Shakespeare came Thomas Aquinas and the Lives of the Saints. And those were the early pillars of Joyce's intellectual edifice. And there were many more, as you are about to hear. And not only that, take in the colloquial, the vernacular. Joyce was across all kinds of localized writing in Ireland. The theatre, the music hall, daily, evening, and weekly newspapers and magazines. Even as a youngster, he must have been ingesting all the time. And, as you'll learn, he must even have read the advertisements, and with close attention. So, bearing in mind that we're talking here about a man in his early 30s, here's a list of the writers of whom James Joyce must have had a working knowledge, because he has mentioned them, drawn upon them, referred to them, or buried them in his references, where I've found them in the unpacking I've been doing so far, and that is only up to a point early in chapter 3. It's some list. Here it is, in the order in which they appear. Homer, obviously, since almost the entire novel is predicated upon him. The prophet Malachi or Malachi. Swinburne, the poet. Xenophon. George Russell, a literary contemporary of Joyce's in Dublin, who wrote under the pseudonym A.E. The German thinker Friedrich Nietzsche. The Scottish poet Robert Burns. William Shakespeare. Oscar Wilde. The English poet Matthew Arnold. William Butler Yeats. The Welsh mythological cycle The Mabinogion. William Sharp, the English paganist writer. The English philosophers David Hartley and John Locke. Sir Isaac Newton. The Irish playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. The Irish writer Edwin Hamilton. The Hindu theological cycle, the Upanishads. The Bible, Book of Leviticus. Walt Whitman, St. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle. The popular 19th century English novelist Captain Frederick Marryat. Dante and his Inferno, major contributor, as you'll find out. Aristotle, I mentioned him already, didn't I? Yes. Virgil and his Aeneid. Carlo Goldoni, the 18th century Italian playwright. Arius and the Arian heresy. Valentine, the 2nd century Gnostic, or Gnostic. The wonderful, wonderful William Blake. The Italian 17th century philosopher Gian-Battista Vico, or Vico. Blind John Milton. 2 12th century philosophers, the Arabian Averroes and the Jewish Maimonides. Giordano Bruno, the extraordinary Bruno, the famous Italian 16th century philosopher and monk and spiritual rebel, full of wanderlust and general buck. Herodotus, in some ways the daddy of them all. Jacob Boehme, the 16th century German philosopher. Bishop Berkeley, the Irish phenomenologist. The Great Bear himself, Dr. Samuel Johnson. And Gotthold Lessing, a famous German gentleman of the theatre in the 18th century. And as I say, that's only the list so far. Right. Some observations. First of all, I've counted them so that you don't need to. And I make it 42, so to speak, literary sources in 46 pages of one version that I'm using. I counted from a 1992 Penguin paperback. And I haven't included Catholic worship or multiple occurrences. That's to say, the number of times Joyce refers to, for example, Aristotle or William Blake or Shakespeare or the Bible. And by the way, I should tell you this. I really will. On a crude page count, I am at 5% of the text. Therefore, not allowing for greater and lesser densities to unpack, do the math, as they say. If I do 5% in almost 2 years, multiply 2 by 20. This is a 40-year project. But it's impossible to tell that because, as I say, some parts will be denser than others and be rather slow, whereas other parts will gallop by paragraphs at a time, needing no explanation. So I'll stick with my 25-year estimate. 25 years from today. That's what I'm guessing. So what are we learning about Joyce and Ulysses here, even in this very short list? What is Joyce doing by invoking all these other writers? The general observation of Ulysses has long been that it is, so to speak, a map of a single day in Edwardian Dublin, while also being a chronicle of emotions ranging from love to grief. But is it not also, given how he draws on philosophy, theology, history, folklore, classical mythology, is it not also a very full map of the human spirit, and how, in Western society and even beyond, the human spirit has been accustomed to working? I've always thought so, and I think this list proves it. You see, the problem has always been that the novel has been so impenetrable. Candidly, it's way beyond the reach of what publishers used to call the ordinary reader. And that's a fact. And that's why I have embarked on this extraordinary enterprise. And one of the ways in which I think to deal with the impenetrability has been, or should be, to look at Joyce's own sources. From his sources, we begin to define his concerns and his methods. You go to what you like and what you understand. And the first thing we begin to suspect, even from this initial trawling of the writers and thinkers on whom Joyce drew, is that Ulysses is, above all else, a novel of thought. I don't mean thoughtfulness, I mean thought as in philosophy. From the reading list alone, you can make a roadmap of the intellectual concerns in the novel. But I hear you argue that, so to speak, is only the brain. What about the rest of us? What about the part of us that most of us use more than any other part? The emotions, the day-to-day mood. Well, if we can track the intellectual pathway from the reading list, a close watch on the moods of the characters, and above all, the style and technique of each chapter will give us a fix on the emotions of the characters. Simplest, briefest example. In chapter 1, what is Stephen doing? He's up on the roof of the Martello Tower. He's being bullied verbally, as usual, by Buck Mulligan. And he's in mourning for his recently deceased mother. All these facts we know from the language that Joyce uses, from the way he describes Stephen's anxiety, from the blustery words he gives to Mulligan. The simplest thing would be to say that Ulysses succeeds on the intellectual and the emotional levels. But it's difficult to conceive an understatement as big as that one in the fields of literature, that Ulysses succeeds on the intellectual and the emotional levels. That's like saying that Shakespeare wrote skits. What I like, and it's been part of my delight in excavating Joyce's reading list so far, is that James Joyce, as a writer, understood one thing above all else. He wasn't just showing off his reading skills and range. No. He understood that as human beings we are not alone, and we should not be. Even he, with his superior education and his gigantic brain, even James Joyce, needed the company of other writers and needed to refer to their works. That's it. That's my baker's dozen. Next week, next Wednesday, business as usual. Join me then. Rejoice, episode 97. Ladies and Liberties. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. And now, believe it or not, we get a little run of seemingly normal narrative in Chapter 3 of James Joyce's Ulysses. Let me read it to you. Seemingly normal. Ha! I can hear your sighs of relief from here. Here we go. They came down the steps from Leahy's terrace prudently, Frauenzimmer, and down the shelving shore flabbily, their splayed feet sinking in the silted sand. Like me, like Algy, coming down to our mighty mother. Number one swung lordily her midwife's bag, the other's gamp poked in the beach. From the Liberties, out for the day. Mrs. Florence McCabe, relict of the late Patrick McCabe, deeply lamented of Bright Street. One of her sisterhood lugged me squealing into life. End of quote. And now I can hear your indignant gasps of incredulity from here. You're saying that's what he's calling normal? Really? Dude? Or words to that effect. Okay, slow down there, slow down. I said seemingly normal. Emphasis on the seemingly. And it did have a moment or two of narrative, describing as it does a pair of ladies descending from the road to the beach at Sandymount Strand, along which Stephen is walking on the 16th of June at 11 o'clock in the morning, 1904. Okay, let's have a go at it. They came down the steps from Leahy's terrace prudently, Frauenzimmer, and down the shelving shore flabbily, their splayed feet sinking in the silted sand. Leahy's terrace is still there, in Sandymount, a little road abutting the beach. But I'm pretty sure, and I'm not certain of this, so if I'm wrong, please be kind, I'm pretty sure there are no steps there anymore. The word prudently? Well, there's a tiny masterclass in how to use an adverb. It tells you that they walked carefully down the steps so as to be safe and not fall. Prudently. Love it. Frauenzimmer. German word, archaic now, a synonym for woman, but with an interesting range, which is why Joyce used it here, because he has reverted for an instant to being a normal novelist and done a tiny bit of characterization in a tiny bit of narrative. Frauenzimmer ranges in nuance from woman respectable to what the Americans call a broad, a female of the species, a little heartier, shall we say, than you'd find in a drawing room, a lady comfortable with her own version of virtue. Joyce is making a social comment here. These are two women, as we're about to find out, from a not totally salubrious area of Dublin, yet they have their own respectability, as we're about to find out. Now, Joyce describes their little journey by the sea, and as you see them, and you do, listen to the words he uses. Listen to the recurring letter S. And down the shelving shore, flabbily, their splayed feet sinking in the silted sand. Why so much alliteration, and in particular the letter S? Think about it for a second. What, among other things, have we been dealing with? Ineluctable modality of the audible, sound. And what susurring, sibilant sound might we be hearing on a seashore? The swish of the sea. And look at what we already know about them. They walk cautiously, and they're flabby and flat-footed, so we might assume that they're on the lower slopes of Frauenzimmer, of womanhood. Now comes a mysterious line, not narrative, Stephen's thoughts again. Like me, like Algy, coming down to our mighty mother, he thinks. Recognize it? Yes, you do, if you've been with me from day one. It was in Rejoice number 7, I feel certain. Algy is the poet Algernon Swinburne, mentioned in chapter 1, who wrote The Triumph of Time, which contained the line, I will go back to the great sweet mother, mother and lover of men the sea. I will go down to her, I and none other, close with her, kiss her, and mix her with me. Ah, but Swinburne wasn't the only one to use the term mother for matters maritime or universal. Joyce had a great affection for a Dublin literary man who encouraged him, George Russell, who wrote, you know this already from last week, from the special last week, who wrote under the pseudonym A.E. And in George Russell's poem, To One Consecrated, you'll find this line, The mighty mother nourished you, her breath blew from her mystic bowers, their elfin glimmer floated through the pureness of your shadowy hours. So that's it, that's mighty mother. Next sentence, Number one swung lordily her midwife's bag, the other's gamp poked in the beach. Translation? The first woman heaved her midwife's bag heavily, bulkily. Lordily, from a French word, it's long obsolete, meaning heavy. In France, you'll still see the sign on a truck, poids lourd, heavy load, or, strictly speaking, heavy weight. And by the way, keep an eye on that midwife's bag. It'll be important next week. And now, of course, we know what she is. The other's gamp poked in the beach. Know what a gamp is? An umbrella. And herewith, another little juicy Joycean morsel. An umbrella came to be called a gamp because in Charles Dickens's novel Martin Chuzzlewit, the lady with the big umbrella is Mrs. Gamp. Sarah Gamp, Sary Gamp. And what is Mrs. Gamp's profession? Listen, just for the fun of it, it's a digression, I know, but it'll give you a little breather. I'm going to read from Dickens, our first acquaintance with Mrs. Gamp. Hold on, it's here, it's in... I have a bookmark on it. It's chapter 19. Here we go. Where's it? Yes. This lady lodged at a bird fancier's, next door but one to the celebrated mutton pie shop, and directly opposite to the original cat's meat warehouse, the renown of which establishments was duly heralded on their respective fronts. It was a little house, and this was the more convenient, for Mrs. Gamp being in her highest walk of art, a monthly nurse, or, as her signboard boldly had it, midwife. That's Mrs. Gamp. Others Gamp poked in the beach. Isn't Dickens wonderful? Next line. From the Liberties, out for the day, Mrs. Florence McCabe, relict of the late Patrick McCabe, deeply lamented of Bride Street. The Liberties is a district of Dublin, big tourist area now, lots of pubs and cafes and stuff. Relatively small compared to what it used to be. Once a thriving centre of commercial weaving, in Joyce's time a dreadful slum, but always deeply authentic in terms of who was and who was not a true Dubliner. The Liberties, by the way, the name comes from the fact that they were a little protectorate. The people paid no taxes because they were owned by an earl, but much more important, they were within the catchment of two great medieval cathedrals, Christ Church and St. Patrick's. I remember seeing a fabulous production of T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, where the armoured knights who had arrived to kill Thomas a Becket actually hammered on the cathedral doors behind us in the audience. Terrifying. So, from the Liberties out for the day is Mrs. Florence McCabe, relict of the late Patrick McCabe, deeply lamented of Bride Street, relict, the person left behind. She's taking the air by the sea. Now, this is interesting. Given the available records, and I know I'm missing some, I don't, for example, have my Thumb's 1904 street directory, which Joyce used. There wasn't a Florence McCabe that I can trace living in Bride Street in June 1904. But there was a Patrick McCabe on Bridge Street, and I wonder whether this might not be the famous error factor in the printing of Ulysses, because I'm damn sure that Joyce didn't pluck that widow's name or the dead man's name from the air. He consulted newspapers, street directories, census reports. He wrote letters home saying, tell me this, tell me that. Everything he needed, he wanted for the construction of his legendary verisimilitude. Okay, that's it. We'll leave her there, Mrs. McCabe, as Joyce said. I've quoted it already. One of her sisterhood, that's to say a midwife, lugged me squealing into life. And next week, we'll finish that paragraph.